continuing growth and the growth of the mobile medical clinics around Camata came increasing pressure and abuse from local communities, often encouraged by the religious and political leaders of Ancarimas. Much of it became focused on Cipriano, who had brought all of this on the community. Cipriano was beaten and tortured several times by persons from Ancarimas. But Cipriano continued. He used to say, "I was afraid of nobody." Welcome to Season 2 of Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is episode number 5, Tata Cipriano Titirico, the first rural indigenous Methodist who faced horrible community justice for his faith. I am Reverend David Stevenson. Last week we heard how in the early 1920s a peon named Tata Cipriano Titirico, who's living under an abusive patron in Camata on the Altiplano, decided he wanted more for him, his family, and community. He wanted education. We heard how he simply left the patron, walked 40 miles to La Paz looking for help, and there he found the Los Andes Methodist Church and Pastor Nestor Peñaranda, Professor Mariano Molina, and the reluctant missionary Virginia Whitehead. We left the story as the 1927 annual conference began. The conference was about to make one of the most important decisions the IMB has ever made. This conference is especially notable because it was attended by 6 superheroes of the IMB. Dr. Frank and Bessie Beck, who had just returned from Bolivia after a 5-year furlough for Frank to get his medical degree. Professor Mariano Molina, who had suffered so much at Guatahata, and his wife. Cipriano Titirico, and the reluctant missionary Virginia Whitehead. These 6 people were about to change the course of the IMB forever. The delegation from Camata, led by Cipriano, arrived in La Paz on the opening day of the annual conference of the Methodist Church in Bolivia in 1927. With the help of Pastor Peñaranda and Professor Molina, Cipriano Titirico and the others spoke passionately about the need for a church, medical care, and especially a school for Camata. The delegates were impressed with the commitment of these men, and their call for help especially moved the now Dr. Frank Beck and Bessie. The conference agreed to help and assign Pastor Nestor Peñaranda and Dr. Frank Beck to go and investigate the need and the possibilities. Within a few weeks, in the early months of 1928, Frank and Nestor hopped on some motorcycles, one with a sidecar filled with medical supplies, and set out for Camata. The road to Camata was unpaved and little used in those days. When Dr. Beck and Pastor Peñaranda arrived in Camata, they set up a little outdoor clinic with the medicines that they had brought, but very few patients came. The Catholic priest in the nearby town of Ancarimas didn't want anyone working with the untouchables. In fact, they diligently worked in opposition to any Protestant work with the indigenous people. Priests, almost exclusively of European descent, would tell the indigenous people, quote, "You will be cursed by God if you take any of these medicines which you North Americans give out," end quote. He even said that they had evil spirits and only wished them harm. Cipriano and the others who were meeting secretly in his home did all they could to encourage their neighbors to come to the little health clinic. But no matter what they said, only a handful of patients came. One patient who did come asking for help was Felipe Felisa Callasayas. Felipe was a 6-year-old boy who came on his own. Felipe's mother had died and his father had remarried, and his stepmother hated him. His dad basically abandoned him. Even the community had forsaken him because the father wouldn't care for him. He would sleep at home when he could, but often he slept outside all alone. He survived by begging and eating what little food he could find. This at an age of 5 or 6 years old. Felipe was quite ill, but also quite afraid. He had heard the stories of the voodoo American doctor. I'm not exactly sure what his illness was, but apparently many folks in town knew he had it. And Philippe was suffering so much he was willing to risk talking to the voodoo American doctor, anything to relieve his suffering. So Philippe very hesitantly approached Dr. Beck. After some discussion, Dr. Beck was able to convince young Philippe to take some medicine. He took it and quickly vanished. Just a few hours later, the local town leaders decided they did not like what they saw. Consequently, they contacted the municipal government leaders, who would be what we would call county officials. The mayor of Ancorimas rode a horse the 10 miles or so to Camata to observe and, to be honest, to shut down the clinic. The Hispanic Criollo mayor demanded, quote, "What do you mean by disturbing the peace of these tranquil villagers? On what authority are you to build a school and treat the sick?" Unquote. No education and being sick is his definition of being tranquil. Frank had not brought his authorization letter from the president to be a Bolivian doctor, so the mayor held Frank in jail and contacted the judge to prosecute Frank. The judge arrived quickly, but as God would have it, the judge was a graduate of the American Institute of La Paz, and he knew the Becks. The judge quickly dismissed the case, admonished the city leaders to welcome Dr. Beck and the new clinic and the school. Early the next morning, a rumor ran through the village. To the surprise and shock of the whole community, little Philippe had gotten better. Suddenly, all of Camata was willing to receive medical help from Dr. Beck. Frank and Nestor stayed until their medical supplies ran out. With the successful medical work by Beck and Piñaranda, the community was now more open to Cipriano's idea of having a school and a church. In August of 1928, the Methodist bishop and Cipriano asked Cipriano's mentor, Professor Mariano Molina, to go to Camata and join Cipriano in this very dangerous mission. Molina and Cipriano would create a school, and together they would teach. Professor Molina had already acquired a certain amount of fame for his brave work with James Wimberg in Santiago de Guatajata. Cipriano told Molina that they would charge the students 10 centavos per student. That's 1/10 of one Boliviano, approximately 2 cents, which wasn't much but had some value in those days. It, along with sharing the food from Cipriano's fields, such as chuño, potatoes, ocas, and such, would help fill most of Molina and his wife's basic needs for food, but not completely. Cipriano also built a small hut on his land for the Molinas to live in. The Methodist Church, including the missionaries and the Criollo church leaders, this time could not ignore what was happening in Camata. So they added the incredibly small amount of 14 Bolivianos a month to help Pastor Molina and his wife to eat. It was probably the equivalent of less than $2 a week. Professor Molina and his wife, a couple already deeply committed to the God of the cross and used to taking risks for God, agreed to come and visit the community to see if they could teach the children and the adults there. Cipriano could not have been happier. Somehow, Cipriano and Molina managed to recruit 15 students to attend the school. Cipriano built a little adobe school building on his land in Camata. This was the first small altiplano school designed specifically to educate the campesino adults and children since the closure of the Guatajata school over 10 years earlier. When the superintendent finally decided it was time to drop in on Molina to inspect the work that was going on in the Camata school, he was shocked and offended to find that the professor was teaching with a lump of coca in his cheek. Coca was strictly forbidden by the church because it was a stimulant and illegal in the United States. The superintendent and others asked, "How is it possible, Professor Molina, that you choose coca in front of your students?" He replied, "I don't have anything to eat, and the coca reduces the hunger." The superintendent didn't say a word. He just turned around, left perplexed, and mired in shame. The patron wanted to bring the hammer down on Cipriano and Molina because he feared it would lead to an uprising of the peons, and he wanted to continue to exploit them out of their ignorance. Yet if he forced them out, that could also lead to an uprising against him. So the patron decided to let the peones of Camata and Ancarimas to do his dirty work. He knew that many of the peones in Camata opposed the school and the Methodist Church. They would have gladly voted, like the peones did in Watahata, not to allow the Methodists have a school to teach literacy to the, quote, Indians, unquote. They were filled with superstitions, and the local priest blamed everything bad that happened in the village on the Methodists. Sickness, droughts, floods, whatever, it was because God was mad at the community for allowing these evil Protestants to become a part of their town. The patron knew that as long as the priest kept them stirred up, they would either eventually attack the school and church, or they would vote as a community for them to be removed. Again, because of the successful medical work of Dr. Beck, no such vote was taken. However, the local priest continued to fire up and incite the locals to throw the Methodists out of town. Several assaults had already been made on the school premises. The threats were constant. Despite the willingness of some in the community to send their children to be educated, the threats were occasionally turned into actual assaults on the little adobe school Cipriano had built. In one of those attacks, they destroyed 10 tables plus its doors and windows, built with the money of the people who had understood the goodness of his work. This usually happened on religious holidays when there was a lot of drinking and a lot of drunken bravado being shown. This actually happened at least 10 times in a few years, according to Pastor Molina. Molina and his wife would sleep in their clothing at night so they would be able to immediately escape if they felt threatened. Whenever someone asked Molina why he stayed, he would always say, quote, "I'm the first to suffer, but later there will come workers with great faith." Although most townspeople opposed Cipriano throughout his life, some saw something different. Some saw a man of faith, a man of love, a man committed to making the world better. He was committed, called, and to bring education to his family and to his community. Slowly, quietly, first one, then another, joined Cipriano in his work. They helped at the school, and they even began to attend secret worship services in Cipriano's or Molina's home to pray, study the Bible, and have worship. Preaching the gospel became more and more difficult as time passed. In the larger towns, the patrons and mestizos became increasingly hostile. And in the small indigenous communities around Camata, the patrons encouraged and urged the community members to reject Cipriano, reject Dr. Beck and Pastor Molina, and to not accept the gospel message anywhere. Dr. Beck and Pastor Peñaranda returned several times to Camata each year, and in order to reach potential patients, Dr. Beck and Peñaranda would also frequently venture out to the small villages surrounding Camata and bring some basic medical care to the people there. But the patrons and the Catholic Church would find out about the planned trip before they arrived, and they would go and spread their lies about Dr. Beck and the medicine he was bringing. It was not unusual for him to enter a village and find that the whole population had left at the suggestion of the priest. The priest wanted everyone to avoid any contact at all with the voodoo American Protestant doctor. No one would receive the medicines. Despite arrests, empty villages, over the next several years, Dr. Beck pressed on. His love for Christ and for the indigenous people compelled him to keep trying. Cipriano not only wanted to bring education to Camata, but also the gospel. While the village had a Catholic church in it, as most Bolivian villages do, the villagers were only nominally Catholic. Worship and Mass would only happen once or twice a year, and that's still true today. But its primary purpose was to do baptisms for all the children who had been born in the village over that year. Cipriano wanted them to have more. He wanted them to come to know Christ in a personal way and learn to live their faith. He wanted a pastor to come and preach and start a church, but of course this was an extremely dangerous thing to do. Finally, in 1928, Cipriano, Molina, and Beck decided to try to start a small church which was to become the second Aymara and first rural Aymara Methodist church in Bolivia. And sure enough, a significant number of people came to the service, if only to politely listen to Dr. Beck preach. At the first worship service, both Pastor Molina and Dr. Beck preached. At the end of that first Methodist worship service, to the indigenous people in the Altiplano, Dr. Beck gave an invitation to become a Christian, to be baptized and join the church. Only one person joined the church that day. The little 6-year-old boy, Felipe Calicius, who thus became the first indigenous person to be baptized on the Altiplano and the first member of the Methodist Church of Camata. This because, of course, Cipriano had already been baptized and was a member of La Redeemer in La Paz. Soon, Cipriano was visiting other villages and telling them about the importance of education and sharing his faith in God. Several members of nearby communities also attended and then joined the Methodist Church in Camata. Despite arrests, empty villages, ostracism, and humiliation, these 4 men, Cipriano, Molina, Beck, and Peñaranda, pressed on. And slowly, more and more people attended the medical clinics in Camata and surrounding villages, and slowly, more and more persons joined the Methodist Church, including those who would walk into Camata from surrounding villages. The church continued to grow and still exists today. In fact, the church at Camata was later renamed the Cipriano Titirico Methodist Church. With its continuing growth and the growth of the mobile medical clinics around Camata came increasing pressure and abuse from local communities, often encouraged by the religious and political leaders of Ancaraímas. Much of this became focused on Cipriano, who had brought all of this on their community. Cipriano was beaten and tortured several times by persons from Ancaraímas. But Cipriano continued. He used to say, quote, "I was afraid of nobody," end quote. Cipriano Titirico and Professor Molina and his wife suffered the most from the abuses, threats, humiliations, and beatings from the community as the founder of the Methodist Church in Camata. However, the gospel of Jesus Christ grew by giant steps with the audacity of the first evangelicals, who were Manuel Ramos, Mariano Titirico, Jose Maria Titirico, Gregorio Titirico, Eusebio Taya Acagua, Mariano Cayasaya, Nicolas Ticona, Manuel Cayasaya, Dionisio Ticona, Francisco Cayasaya, Valentin Lamachi, Lorenzo Ramos, Luis Titirico, and others. Some of the other brothers from Camata who faced this oppression were Elfas Avia, Miguel Soruto, Primotiva Castro, Cura Rodas, and others, but they were always defended and supported by Cipriano. There were also brothers from other communities who were members of the Camata Church who suffered through a series of abuses and humiliations from authorities and people who opposed the gospel. Among them were Cayetano Hilaquita and Valiano Canaza from the community of Logiata, Brother Torres from Ispaya, Brother Zunavi from Lojrocachi, Brother Vilca de la Calle, and Brother Pacha from Pacharia, and other communities that cannot be remembered. Cipriano spent the rest of his life working his fields, preaching and teaching at his little church and his little school. Cipriano went on to become one of the most important leaders in the beginning of the movement to educate the indigenous people in the Campo. And so it was that 78 years later, after the founding of the church in August of 2006, I and dozens of Methodist leaders from all over Bolivia and all over the world gathered at that little church, now renamed the Cipriano Titirico Church, to honor this courageous and indigenous man of faith and his commitment. The information for this podcast comes from several sources. First was the speech that I talked about at the beginning of the previous episode by Cipriano's grandson, Lorenzo Cipriano Titirico, to the crowd of international delegates celebrating the centennial of the IMB in 2006. There were several other sources that added to the story. First, we found a little 12-page type paper called The Historia de la Iglesia Loco Cipriano Titirico, Camata Norte, Distrito Lago, Obra Pionero de la Iglesia Evangelica Methodista in Bolivia, Camata, September 15, 1984, or The History of the Local Church Cipriano Titirico, the North Lake District. 2. I also have recorded various Bolivian Methodists tell me the part of Cipriano's story that they know. And third, other material for this episode came from interviews and conversations with Antonia Poma, the wife of Bishop Ambassador Eugenio Poma, and is the daughter of Felipe Felicia Calles, better known as Feliciano or Happy. On the website www.weavingtheblanket.com, you will find access to most of these sources. There is a bonus episode about the Tata Cipriano Church when I was there for the anniversary of the church. And if you watch, you will see literally cake on my face. Next week, we will continue the story of Anchorimus and the young man Feliciano and experience a night of terror as a drunken mob came to the clinic and announced they were going to burn down the school along with the 3 indigenous pastors that were in it. Join us next week as we learn how God led them out of this danger. See you next week.